Everybody, welcome to almost the final session of GrrCON 2019. So I'm very happy to have you guys all here, and you get to watch and listen to Kat for just a little bit. She's going to tell you about the GRU for a little while. I think that's who it is, right? Is that GRU? And she has I was making a joke earlier because I'm just kind of semi-nerdy. I'm like, is that your real name? I was thinking concatenate, like cat, self, something or another, but that's nerd jokes. So everybody, please give a very warm welcome to Kat Self.
Okay, yep, everyone can hear me. So thank you all so much for coming. Just as kind of a call out, this presentation happened because of several key individuals who know who they are, and thank you. Thank you very much. So whenever a person is presenting, there is a ton of work that goes on in the background, whether it is the dry runs where you're making people suffer through your constant monologue, or if it's through the actual environment setup or just getting the code working in general. So we shall begin. My name is Kat Self. I work at Target. I'm a lead threat hunter. Formerly, I was a red teamer. And then I also, my previous career prior to getting into InfoSec, as we discussed earlier in the keynote, we all have this meandering path. I was in military intelligence for a while. The reason why I'm going to give this, or why I wanted to give this talk so bad, was I was actually at GrrCON last year, and I listened to a talk. And the talk was basically by two people that were doing a red team and blue team. And the blue teamer was someone that was just genuinely wanting to get to know, how does this work? How does this look in our environment, right? That was one reason why they wanted to go after this blue and red, is because what does this look from the other side? And I loved that. And I realized when I started looking around at people that I work with, all of the defenders that I work with have that same drive, right? We have that curiosity, how does this work? What am I missing? How can I capture everything? And I wanted to be able to provide a repeatable process on how to do that. Another thing I came across was when I was going to a lot of red team conferences, I would talk to different red teamers and they would discuss yeah, I did this. And I was like, that's really cool. How do you emulate these threat actors? What does that look like? How do you even know what the threat actor that cares about you in particular? And they were like, well, we just do this, right? It's all the threats. That's what we're doing. And I realized that this is kind of when my background came to play, right? Not all of us have a former career in military intelligence. So the way I look at things is very different than the way other people look at things. And I didn't realize the significance of that really until I started having these conversations. I was like, well, where do you get this information? How do you back this up? When you're talking about this threat, how do you, when you're talking to leadership about this threat, how do you be yeah, this is why this is significant. Here's the context around this behavior, right? I didn't realize that wasn't just something that we all did. And so I wanted to also be able to go over what does it look like when you don't have a cyber threat intelligence team, right? How does that collection process for what is this threat? How is it even relevant? How do I collect data to actually back up what I'm doing technically? I wanted to go over what that process looked like. And to do this, I basically did a case study. And that is essentially what we're going to be walking through during this talk. I also was a former artist in a previous life. Some of you will find my artwork out on the internet. It was successful for a very short period of time. There's a reason why I am in this field now. But I love the parallels, because the parallels with art is that what you're doing is you're constantly trying to make yourself better. You're constantly trying to perfect a technique, right? And there's a lot of parallels between art forgery and art. So a long time ago, back in the Renaissance age, there was an artist. Now, back in those days, the way that you got better at art was you found a mentor, and then you became their apprentice. And then what you did was you took one specific technique of that mentor's, and you would emulate it, and you would emulate it again, and you would do it until the fact that you couldn't tell the difference between that master's work and your own. Well, this particular artist took this Sleeping Eros, and he recreated it to the point where he actually took tea to give it that antique look. So, well, he didn't know what to do with it afterwards. So he gave it to his friend, right? Because that's what we do. We give our rejects to our friends. And so true. And, well, his friend sold it, which, by the way, this also happened to me. Same thing. Not to this degree, obviously. So his friend sold the piece of artwork to a cardinal. So a couple of years pass, this cardinal has this, what he thought was an original Sleeping Eros, right? Like this was a statue that was 200 years old at the time. And he realized, oh wait, it's actually over here, and this is the original, and I know this guy, so it's got better credibility. So mine must be a fake. So he was pissed. So he went back to the guy that sold the artwork, and he was like, so where did you get this from? Who do I need to basically kill, right? And he was like, oh, well, that was Michelangelo's, and he's a big artist now. And he was like, oh, his response was, well, I guess he must be a master if even I couldn't tell the difference between that. So the idea is that you kind of know you're the master when you're able to replicate it so well that you can't even tell the difference between the two. When I started off this, it was super overwhelming because I honestly had no idea where to start. I was like, okay, I know I want to do a thread emulation. I know I want to do a super good technical job on it, but where do I begin, right? There's a lot of different talks out there that cover a lot of different areas, but not a lot of them actually cover the full life cycle and what this looks like from start to finish. So what I started with was I took two frameworks that I knew really well. One of them was software development lifecycle. I took that framework because, and the reality is, when we're emulating threat actors, we're really emulating this malware, right? Like if we want to build detection on this, I need to really understand the malware, the signatures, and more so the behavior. Like how does it run? Why is it running that way? How is it installing persistence? Stuff like that. The other framework that I used or wanted to use was the intelligence lifecycle. In my former career, I was an intelligence collector. So there's a whole lot of things that go along with that, right? But with the way we go about finding information, then we take that information, we parse it, we analyze it, we process it, then we dig deeper, we figure out what's missing. Okay, this information is coming from this source. How can I collaborate that information with this information from this source? Like what's the similarities, right? So I took those two life cycles and then I combined them into one. So this is essentially, for those of you that are familiar with this, the Agile Lifecycle. I know, we're agile up in here in thread emulation. So the way this starts is essentially we choose a threat actor, right? In the intelligence lifecycle, we want to pick a direction. So that's usually where everything goes. You kind of can't go anywhere until you have a focus. So picked an actor, gathered the info. This is essentially where I'm going to be doing all the massive data collection, right? The next phase is the software development, which for me was fun because we're literally creating malware, which is always awesome. And then there's the test and the iterate, right? Like this is where we're going to go through and make sure like, okay, does this match up to what I'm also like, when I'm detecting this malware, the real stuff, and then when I'm repeating this with my stuff, similarities, and then the differences, where do those meet and collide? And then finally, which is the fun, like also fun, all of it's fun, the last fun part, right, which is where we get to play with the kill chain, which is the Lockheed Martin kill chain for a better reference, right? The initial infection, the persistence and the collection and so on, which we'll have pretty diagrams later to go over. So picking a direction, I specifically chose Fancybear. The reason why I chose Fancybear was because they have a wonderful selection of reports. There's a lot of really great people in this field that have done a ton of work. A lot of reverse engineers that have gone super deep and literally written out the source code for some of this malware. So I wanted to be able to showcase a specific malware from a threat actor that was also known to target macOS. So that was also a key element. macOS is actually not very well represented in threat actors. I would talk to our cyber threat intelligence team because we are very fortunate at Target to have one. And they were like, well, Macs kind of aren't on the radar for a lot of these specific groups. And I was like, but they're on the radar. Like, we just don't know. So I wanted to pick this guy because there's a lot of stories about how something will get uploaded and then downloaded in the real world environment and then uploaded back to VirusTotal, or a proof of concept will get uploaded or disseminated to the community. Then that same proof of concept will be manipulated. That proof of concept will then be uploaded into VirusTotal from a real world company, and then you've just gotten to see the fact that we just don't know who that is. And that's it. So it's happening. We just don't know who, as we go deeper. The last thing that I wanted to also pick for Fancy Bear was just like the name. I thought the name was awesome. So I would be remiss if I did not go over this part, right? So threat profiling is a huge deal. I like to think of this in two parts, right? One is, would these guys target me? It's almost kind of like a Venn diagram. You have to look at it from a couple of different perspectives, right? Like, should I care about these guys, and should these guys care about me? It's kind of a twofold perspective. There's also an easy way to kind of simplify this. There's a lot of people that do some really great talks on threat profiling. I cited a paper from the SANS Institute. They go over that stuff much better. You'll notice I actually cite a lot of different things in these slides. So just in case you all want to take pictures, you can dig deeper into some of the research. There's tons of research on all of these areas. It's a lot of broad topics. In this specific case, one way that I've gone about this to be able to do it simplified is I'll take hacktivists. What hacktivists are in the geographic location that is relevant to my company? Like partnerships. What companies do I actually actively have partnerships with that this threat actor would care about, or this hacktivist, or this cyber criminal? Fancy Bear is extremely well known to do a lot of misattribution. They love playing on cybercrime domains, or, oh, we're going to play over this one, like this Apple Auto update. That looks legit. So they do a lot of this misattribution to be able to play both in the cybercrime world and then also the nation state actor world. So this is kind of where that threat profiling comes in, right? Like what falls in that scope. So I know what lens to put on when I'm looking at these different specific threat actors. Just to kind of go over a few more things. Intellectual assets. Do I have anything that they actually care about? Whether that is schematics or whether that is the ability to collect different information. Do I have any communication equipment that might be significant that they can then leverage? Like, do I offer security services, or do I offer actual services like Dropbox, right? Where I would have access to tons of systems. Like, that's kind of what falls into the scope. Like, what partnerships? Just because I might not be the target doesn't mean I won't be leveraged to get to somebody else. The next thing is the gathering the info. So the big thing about gathering info is that it is not okay, I did all the things, I'm done. That's not the way that works. It's usually the way it works is you start one area, you find a ton of gaps, and then you dig down like 17 rabbit holes, and you come back up and you're like, well, that was a waste of time. And then you go down 17 more in another area, and then you find this one little nugget of information, and it correlates to this one other nugget of information, and then you're like, oh my God, that's how they're doing it. And it's like, I spent 20 hours on these many reports for that? So it's not a great payoff, but it is significant because there is something magical about the way the human brain analyzes information. So I definitely want to call that out because as much automation as we can do, nothing will pass the ability for us to be able to put together patterns that don't make sense. One of the areas, so what I'm going to do for a couple of these, because I'm walking you all through a case study that I did, I am going to be releasing an OPML file. So Feedly is a resource that was suggested to me. And basically you can take someone's OPML file, drop it in, and what that does is it gives you the events, the current events. You can have different RSS feeds, and I'll have that on my LinkedIn, or I'll provide that via Keybase or something like that. But for me, that was the start, right? I find out the current events, and then I also continue to dig deeper as I'll go on. Another thing, right, a great place to start, not finish, is the attack framework. They do have a lot of sites referenced that you can kind of begin. ThreatMiner is a data repository. I didn't find out about ThreatMiner until after this, and I was pissed. So you're welcome, just so you know. Enjoy. Another thing is the diagrams so because I want to recreate malware, right? Like that is one of my huge objectives in this project. I need technical reports. I need to be able to drill down to the basics. What has source code? What has actually gone over the malware? Like what actually gives me a really good idea and indicator of what this malware is going to do. So if I run into my environment, I am prepared for whatever it's going to throw at me. So the way I do this is I break it down via kill chain. So since I want to be able to implement this in the software development lifecycle, I'm going to do a assume breach scenario. For me, that makes more sense. We know they're going to click the link. We don't want to say that they're going to click the link. We want to tell all of our leaders that they're not going to click the link, but they're going to click the link. So moving beyond clicking the link, I want to be able to focus on what can I actually build detection, like what behaviors can I build detection around. So this kind of actually bleeds into a lot of the other processes. But this report is actually, I know this is an amazing little pointer. This is actually the report that I use for almost the entire thing. So what I'll do is I'll take this specific report that I find, right? I'll go through and I'll highlight behaviors. I'll highlight what exactly does it do? What folders does it drop it into? What kind of binary is it using? In this case, it takes a macOS file, right? And it drops that. It drops 2 of them. So, and then it also has a whole bunch of other stuff that it does with it, which we'll go through. So I take this, I also break it down. So these are my rabbit holes essentially. Now within each one of these branches, you'll also find it kind of scattering. For me, what I chose to do was I had to eventually pick a malware. What I chose to pick was complex, and that was the initial infection that I chose to emulate. And again, so as I walked through it, I had my initial infection or my exploitation. That same malware, because threat actors are lazy, also installs persistence. So I had my installation. The command and control, I actually was super grateful I did not have to create a panel to be able to interact with their C2 agent. So what I did, and also because this talk is specifically for defenders, like I wanted to be able to provide defenders something. That is super loud. I wanted to be able to provide defenders something that was flexible. So that way, if you all wanted to be able to test out Empire or AppFell's new C2, you could just take your Mako, drop it in, and then it would compile it to be able to recreate it. So that way you could use it. And then you could see if your environment could detect what this is, which is as close as I could get to Fancy Bears. And then the last is the actions on the objective, right? Twitter, it's been mentioned a ton of times. Our community does thrive off of it. The malware that I actually got was from Patrick Wardle. He has a great malware repository for macOS, and he also does a great job of linking the actual technical reports. So Fancy Bear likes to live in the gray. As I mentioned before, they do a lot of playing on the cyber network, and then they also play on, normal nation state collection. Back to the art forgery. There was an artist called Eric Hebborn. Eric he was a rejected artist, actually. So they didn't think his artwork was that good. So what he decided to do was just go and emulate everybody else's artwork that was old masters. Ironically enough. So what he would do, actually, is he would, at night, go get drunk, right? Sure, everyone at GrrCON on Friday has some empathy towards that. So he'd go get drunk, and the reason why he would get drunk is because he wanted to make sure his hand was fluid and relaxed. And what he would do is he would take these artists that he would emulate, these masters, and then he would mimic their sketches. But he wasn't trying to do the exact sketch. He would actually do his own work. But he would make sure it was fluid and it was mimicking their same manners, their same style, the way that they would have that brushstroke on the paper. And the reason why he actually had 300 pieces of work that were actually original pieces of work, but that were mistaken as forgeries because they were so similar to these artists' work. So the reason for this is because emulation, we can get the malware pretty close, right? We have that. We have the technical reports. We've got this data. But the actual emulation of it is an art form. It's all about the motivations. What are the patterns of the threat actor? What do they go after when they first land on a post? What do they need to know? Because, if I'm a red team and I know my environment really well, I don't need to do all these scans and everything, right? I don't need to do a lot of these things because I already know. So emulating the threat actor, they're not going to have a lot of the, innate knowledge that I have. So what would I do? Fancy Bear loves going after credentials. They're super hard on it. So all of the different ways you can do credentials, they're going to do. They're also super lazy. They would rather get your backup files than they would anything else. So they're going to pull all of your iOS backup files if you have your phone backed up on your computer. And that way they can deal with all the decryption later and have it offline, right? So those are the things that when I'm searching in these reports, that's what I'm looking for. And that's where the human component comes in, right? Because those are the patterns. They're not going to be, and then they did this and this and this and we're done. No, it's going to be a really general way. And it's going to change because, again, that threat model is significant, right? What are you going after now? So they're very gray. As you're going through this research, you'll find there is a cone of silence. It is frustrating and it is annoying. Yes, you have I completely understand. The way this works is as you're on the outside of the cone, it's actually pretty easy to get some of this information. If I want to know the signatures, if I want to know the domains they use, we are really good as a community to disseminate that out. As you go in, you have the malware and the tools, right? Gets a little tricky because a lot of threat actors like to look like pen testers. So you got to figure out where that crosses, right? And Fancy Bear's really bad at that because they love to do misattribution. So it gets a little trickier, but still, you can figure it out, right? Like we have the panel or I have the C2 agent inside of the malware that I have. I can have X agent, so I can have that malware. So I can be able to fully emulate that. As you go further in the cone, that's when you have to have a little patience, right? So MITRE ATT&CK framework is great. The downside of the MITRE ATT&CK framework is that you have to wait for a report to be published. So there is that. But again, that information is available. And then it turns into be super, super quiet. And the reason why it gets that quiet is because that's when you have to have a lot of trust with the people you're talking to. That's when you're talking about real cases where someone infiltrated their environment and they don't want to talk about that, right? Then we get into disclosures and we get into all of these other topics that are super tricky and sticky. So the actions on the victim take a little longer to come out. A lot of times, like when we talk about networking, especially with cyber threat intelligence, even our team that we have at Target, a ton of it is through people that you know, through trusted conversations and relationships. And then when we get down all the way to the bottom, where it's the victims and objectives, like, only reason why I know about some of Fancy Bear's victims and objectives is because of those trusted relationships where they told me what they were going after, which they didn't even know what they were going after until months into the campaign. And they were so established in that environment that it was a huge embarrassment for that entire company. So, again, cone of silence, right? So it sucks. It's very frustrating. It is a thing. However, there's also a purpose to it. So as we get down there, right, one example of this is, actually, I'll save that example for later. But when we go through and we talk about things publicly, like, for example, Patrick Wardle did this great macOS, or this, I lost the word because I'm saying it in public. There was this Word document with macros, and he published on his blog like how to go through it. And then like a month later, literally not even actually a month later, someone else uploaded it, and it was another company. And it's like once that information's out there, it can be used, right? Once those domains are out there, like APT28 or Fancy Bear is going to change them. Like once they know that you're tracking like app update iOS, like they're going to change it. So the idea behind this is it is frustrating, but there is also a need for it. So when we're going through and doing this information dissemination, there is a little bit of discernment that we have to have as professionals to make sure that if I'm disclosing this information, like how far does that go and what is the scope of that? So now we get to the software development part, which I had a blast in. So the scoping of the design. I wanted to make sure that I could keep it flexible. So, again, because this is how I dug down into my reports, I am ignoring the delivery. I am picking the exploitation, which I already have the source code for, right? Because that comes from that technical document. The installation, which is going to be a plist file, which again, I have from the document. Command and control, I'm going to use Python. I'm going to use PowerShell Empire because Fancy Bear is known to use PowerShell Empire going throughout all of their campaign, or a lot of their campaigns, other than Xagent, and also what complex can sometimes be called, since the complex C2 is actually different from the Xagent. And then actions on the objective. That's all that misattribution, right? That's going after the credentials, the iOS. Again, all of this, I haven't even coded yet, and I have all of this information parsed out per the kill chain. So this is the technical report I used, just an example of the code that they provided from the report. So there's already a ton of it done. One reason just so you all know, I chose very intentionally to do no reverse engineering in this entire thing. I wanted to make sure that the only thing you needed to have as far as skill sets go was time, stubbornness, and the ability to learn. Like, I didn't even know Objective-C before I started this. So everything that I'm doing is taken directly from this malware that I got. It's taken directly from open source tools. It should be fully recreatable. There's no binary patching. There's no digging deep reverse engineering. It's just pulling it straight out. So I find, like, this is the type of report that I'm looking for, where it has all of these Objective-C methods laid out, right? But I can't just compile this code and run it. Like, I actually have to look at every single line and actually dig a little deeper. Like, what is this doing? Can I actually run this on my production environment and not freak everybody out and, infiltrate my own work, place environment for Fancybear? So the complex malware, here's what it does. Actually, let me get a sip of water because I'm talking a lot. So the very first dropper is binder. So when the email comes in, binder is what's attached to the email. Okay. So when binder lands and it runs, then it creates two other files. Content actually gets dropped as a document file. And then it also drops a PDF file, right? Now, the key to remember is the PDF file is actually a decoy file, right? So, but this is the name of it. Roskomos, which I'm sure I'm mispronouncing because it's Russian. The entire document is in Russian, just so you guys know. It's about the space program. But it drops this file, leaves it there. It actually takes off the PDF extension, which, from what my friends can tell on the CTI team, that's for EDR evasion. But content file, all inside of binder, it actually changes the permissions on content to then turn it into an executable file. So leaves the PDF there, doesn't do anything with it. Going from the content file, then it runs it, right? So all of this is still within binder. Binder is the initial process, and then it's creating these guys. So inside of binder, it changes permissions of content, then launches content. Content, in turn, drops these three files. It drops a plist file, it drops a script, and it also drops kextd, right? Kextd is actually also a document file that then changes the permissions on. And then that is actually the C2 agent for their complex malware, or their Mako file. Then it takes this guy, this plist file, right, which is just a configuration file for Appro, and then it takes this file and then it drops it inside of the user's launch agents, which is a normal auto run feature for Apple. And so every time that user logs in, that's going to run. All of this plist file does is literally takes this guy and run it, and that's it. It's not an executable in there. It just takes kextd and runs it. And then this script actually loads this plist file as a service. And then once all of this is done, which it actually creates a directory inside of the user's shared folder to drop all of these in. Once this is done, it actually goes back to binder. Binder then takes that same PDF and then opens it up in preview. So all of this happens in like a matter of a second. So you don't even realize that this binder executable that you just downloaded created a directory inside of your user's shared folder, drops these three files, launches this plist file to then run this executable, and then opens your PDF file for you. So that's the process and the behaviors that we're going to emulate in the malware that we're creating, right? So in all of this, what I did was I took again, high level, right? Super high level. As I just ran it through a debugger. I had a very specific safe environment. I ran a macOS VM, isolated it, and then just ran this through a very like step-by-step debugger. And then as the scripts were popped out, I copied them over. So that way I could actually look at the scripts, see what was in them, and then that way then I could re-emulate them. Or even just use the same file, which was kind of the point. So recreating the work, right? So again, we're trying to do this at a high level with minimal amounts of reverse engineering. So the way I went about this was I took that same report, which is this guy, and then I just copied it over to my code. So Fancybear is really well known for taking public methods and then like putting it into their code, which quite frankly, we all do. Stack Overflow is like half of my code in everything I do. Thank you for any contributors to Stack Overflow. Just saying. So they're also not above this, right? There is a specific method even that one of the intelligence reports call out where they're like, am I being debugged? And on Apple's like developer website, that is the function that you use if you want to properly find out if your program is being debugged or not. So that's a pattern of behavior, right? Like that was one of those things that we gathered from the collection part. What are the patterns? Fancybear has a great pattern of taking public code and then just copying and pasting. So that's exactly what I did, right? Because it's all about the fluidity of those motions, right? It's not about the exact science. That's where the art form, the emulation comes in. So again, I copied it to the code. Other things is the methods. Objective-C is actually really easy to find the methods by just doing a header file check, so you can actually figure out all the methods. Or better yet, just run strings on the executable, and you'll be able to pull out all of that information, which I will show you how I leverage that information for all the stuff I did not know. The naming convention is another thing. You'll be able to find a lot of those strings for the way that they named a lot of the executables inside of the strings file. Also, there was a situation, well, not a situation, there was, when I was doing a lot of the research for this, I reached out to a lot of my colleagues, because this is, again, one of those things that I don't think I know anyone. I mean, okay, there's a couple of like key leaders, but almost every single person that I know, like they didn't get to where they are by themselves. Like we all stand on the shoulders of the people that we work with and we surround ourselves with, right? Which is what it's all about, which is why this is a community. And one of the things that he found was that there was, and it was when we were talking about this emulation, and his little malware analysis tool found a C2 agent, and it couldn't figure out if it was Cobalt Strike or if it was X agent. And the reason why was because a red team, most likely a red team, had taken this Cobalt Strike agent and then taken all the strings from X agent and then put it in there to make it look like it was Fancybear, right? So little things like that will actually throw off a lot of other things that should be detecting, right? And it's just like another use case for like how you make it look like it's something else. So network traffic, we're not going to have, because again, we're choosing to make, like, we're not creating a panel, right? Like that's a whole another level. That's like thread emulation 102 or 202. So this is basically how I cheated. So for those of you, I could code and it would be amazing code, and I can say that on stage because I'm not going to prove it. But essentially, all I did was I took this technical report sample, right? This is just screenshots from literally the stuff that I produced with fancy shadow boxes. So it's not, as a friend said earlier, stock art. I took the technical report and then I would do a strings analysis. And then from that strings analysis, I would then use my Google superpower. And then I would copy that into my code. So that was literally the process for everything. Like one example of this was I could not, and I haven't quite figured it out yet. So you'll actually see this. Like there is a thing, it's called done is better than perfect. I'm a firm believer in it because like this is one of those things where that test and iterate part, right, in the Agile Lifecycle. Like you just get it done and get it working, and then you can iterate on it and make it look better. Like that's what version control is all about. So, and this is basically how I've approached this problem, right? I'm not going to be able to do everything perfect on this and do it the exact same way. But as I figure it out, as I learn more, I can emulate better. And which is, again, the part why I love the whole art parallel to this. So in this case, I couldn't figure out how they were getting the data in. I have a couple suspicions. I'm still working on it with my colleagues, trying to figure that out perfectly. Has something to do with like NS Dictionary, but I haven't gotten it working yet. But a workaround is like, okay, I don't know how to use this really stupid function. So if anyone wants like to tweet me on like how to freaking get that working, I am open to it. So a workaround of that was, how do I read these files, right? These executables into my program so that way I can emulate all the other behaviors, because I have all the code. Now I just need to be able to have it do it. So especially make it flexible to where I can just run this in Xcode, compile it, and then be done and have my own executable that does the exact same thing. So I use the strings analysis, and there's this data with contents of URL. So I took this function specifically, looked it up on this lovely blog that gives me a perfect code example, and then that is now my code. And then I just change the strings to match what they already provided in the technical report. So this is essentially kind of how I iterated through every single problem. So, because there's a lot of them, right? Like all of the code that they release, they intentionally don't release all of the source code. So there's going to be things that I'm going to have to figure out. But that is essentially like the process and how I figured it out, like step by step, right? Like I started with content and then I worked through content. Like how can I get this running on my host? Like I loaded up an Xcode project because it's Xcode, and apparently that's the only thing that works with Apple for the most part. So I loaded up my Xcode project and I dropped everything in, and then I literally went line by line. Okay, how to declare a string in Objective-C? Then how do you declare this type of object? And then I'll work through that process. There's a couple of things to note. I will be releasing a technical walkthrough, like line by line on how I did this, like to include like these are the compiler flags that you need to add to your Xcode project, right? To make sure ARC is not running, so that way you can actually compile this. There's a lot of little tricky things that I found going through this process, so I will release that. It's just, it takes time to write those things up and write them up well. So, the test and iterate part is fun. Again, as I was going through this process, like, it's not this streamlined, simple thing. The framework was really important to me because I get lost super easy in code, and that's good. Like, I want to get lost in code, right? Like, that means that I'm super into it. I'm following down those rabbit holes, and I'm doing all the things. But when I come back up for error, I always need to be able to figure out, like, okay, what's next? Because a lot of times I'll forget that. So the test and iterate is a part of that process, right? That is that life cycle of the Agile. So as I was going through this, it'd be like, okay, what other methods did I miss? And then I'd run strings, and then I'd compare both of the executables. Like, all right, I've got content working. Wow, what is content doing different? Is it loading a file in a different order? Like, how do I compare these similarities? So for me, that was the process. A neat thing and a parallel with art is that there is no known detection for art forgery to guarantee something is not a fake. So that also kind of goes like, I don't know anyone that said, like, it's literally a joke in our community. It's unhackable. Like, it's literally a joke. And there are pen test groups that go after everything that is unhackable. So I always thought that was a really cool parallel. But to drive this point home is that even as we get better at threat emulation, so does our detection, right? So what does that mean for us? Well, usually that means we get better too. And then we do this, we have this game, right? The red-blue team game. What's neat about Eric Hebern, this is the art forger I was talking about earlier, was he sold his sketches. His sketches then got sold to a museum. Actually, he didn't sell his sketches. He gave it to his friend. His friend sold his sketches to a gallery. The gallery sold his sketches to a museum. The museum curator was like, this is not real. And I know it's not real because I tested the paper. So then the curator is like, you know what? I'm amazing. I need to tell the world about this. So he went on national television and was like, I found a forger. You know how I did it? The paper. The paper was of today's. So it couldn't be this artist. It must be a forgery. So guess what happened next? Eric went out, found all the dictionaries from that time period that he was emulating, and then did all of his drawings on the paper. So again, that cone of silence, right? Like, as we disclose this information on how we do detection, if we do it publicly, like, that also allows our adversaries to then also get better. So, and then there's the red team operation, right? This is, again, another fun part. Like, I don't think there really is anything not fun about this entire process. But this is, so again, the idea of this talk was for that defender that's like super, like, how does this work? Like, what does this look like on the other end? Like, I know what it looks like on this end, but am I catching everything? Like, what am I missing? So this is the part where I don't care whether it's a rubber ducky or a bash bunny or a email, whatever vector you want to pick, whatever vector makes sense for your environment, right? This is where that defender can go and then actually emulate, like, drop this executable, this binder executable that's got our Empire payload or C2 agent in it, and then drop it on the host in production environment, knows what it does, knows every single ounce of that code, right? Because we've already gone through this process. And then be able to see, what did my host catch? What did my SIM catch? What did my EDR detection catch? Watching the logs, and then being able to iterate through that process. And again, then we go back to the red team side, where it's the living in the gray, right? Like, these are the actions that we're doing on the host. Looking at the Chrome, all the cookies and the Chrome files and the backup databases, like looking for the keychain, all of the different methods that we've discussed briefly, as the actions on the objectives. Which, as you do this process and you find these patterns, you'll find that a lot of the things you'll emulate will be based off of conversations. They'll be based off of generalities, but they'll all be to the point, because the reality is, what's the goal in the environment, right? What are you trying to get after? So, and then does your detection stand up to the test of that? So, when I was traveling around to a lot of these different conferences, there are some brilliant people in our field, and I loved that there was so much talent that there was always something new to play with, which is awesome. But for me, that can't be the definition of success. I'm not that good yet. There's a lot of people out there that I like to compare myself to. Not there yet. I am still new in this field. I've still got a lot to learn. So for me, I needed to define a different definition of success, which is, again, why I like the art. And that definition for me was getting good enough to be able to emulate a nation state or a different actor of my choosing, and could you tell the difference between me and them? And then when I got really good at that actor, doing a false flag. Okay, I'm done with Russia. Now what do I look like if I'm Korea? Now that I'm Korea, what do I look like if I'm China? Right? And then working through the different countries, because they all use different techniques. And that kind of allows my own knowledge and my own depth of ability and technical skill to be able to expand as well. So for me, that's kind of how I've defined my own version of success, versus I found 3 of the latest exploits that are released out now. Like, I'm not there, but I can make sure that my skill set is up there where I can do switch which country I'm going to be from on what day, and can you tell the difference? Cost is a huge thing, especially with small things. So I did want to go over this because, again, starving artist budget. This cost me personally a lot of money because I was trying to figure out how much to do with it. The environment setup in and of itself was a pain because there's not many iOS images for a Mac. So what I will be doing is I will be releasing an iOS image probably next week for a Mac on my Keybase. So it'll be like an OVA file, so that way you all can download it, because that was one of the biggest issues in trying to run this in VirtualBox. So I needed to have an OVA file. So I had to get VMware. So the full price of how much this cost me was essentially the bottom one. To be able to run macOS, macOS doesn't actually support the guest VMs. So you have to have, it is under the license agreement that you should use a Mac computer or an Apple computer. So with that said, another thing that I will also point out is friends. Again, this couldn't be done without all of the people that are here. I can't tell you how many Slack channels I'll just be like, what is this? And then 5 people reply. And because we're all curious, right? That's one of the coolest things about this community. We're all like, what is that? Hold on. Let me see if I can get that to work. At dinner last night, I was trying to figure out this file, and 2, 3 people were like, I think I can fix this. And we have our computer, and why are we doing this at dinner? But that's the way we work, and it's awesome. It makes me feel so connected to this community. So, but essentially, this is pretty reasonable for a small company. I will be releasing the ISO image Monday, same with all of the code, because I actually it's actually 2 separate Xcode projects that then get compiled into one for the binder. So I'll release that next week. Also, I will be doing the technical walkthrough, just a lot of words. Words are hard. So I'll be releasing that probably November-ish when I finally have gotten around to time.